The card came by courier, not by mail. Black border, cream paper, the kind of stock that only funeral homes and wedding planners ever ordered. Damian Cross turned it over twice before he opened it, because envelopes like that only ever meant one thing in his family, and it was never good news. Inside, in a calligraphy so careful it looked printed, was an invitation to a memorial service. The date was 3 days out. The location was a chapel he'd never set foot in. And the name of the deceased, centered in the middle of the card like a headline, was his own. In loving memory of Damian Cross. He read it 4 times standing in his own kitchen before he accepted that it wasn't a misprint and it wasn't a joke. Nobody joked in his world with paper like this. Someone had paid real money, gone to a real printer, chosen real words, to announce his death to a room full of strangers before he was dead. His assistant, Sophia, found him still holding it 20 minutes later. "You're not going," she said before he'd said a word, because she knew him well enough to read the set of his jaw. "I'm going," Damian said. "It's a trap. It has a chapel's name on it and a stranger's handwriting, and it showed up 3 days before whatever they're planning." "That's not subtle, Damian. That's an invitation with your name already carved on the stone." "That's exactly why I'm going," he said. "Because whoever sent this wants me to be too afraid to walk in the front door. I'd rather know who's holding the door open than spend the rest of my life wondering." He called Victor that night, the way he called Victor about everything, the way he had called Victor since he was 9 years old and his mother's funeral had been the last thing anyone in the family had properly organized. Victor had raised him more than his father ever had. Quietly, from the second chair, always the one who fixed what broke before Damian even noticed it was cracked. "Don't go alone," was all Victor said. "Take your men. Go armed. Whatever this is, you walk in prepared or you don't walk in at all." Sounded like good advice. It sounded like every piece of advice Victor had given him for 20 years. Damian didn't think even once to ask why a man who had spent his whole career telling him to move quietly, to keep his guns out of sight and his temper out of rooms full of witnesses, was suddenly telling him to walk into a chapel armed. 3 days later, at 7 in the evening, Damian Cross pulled up outside Ashford Chapel and Gardens with a loaded pistol under his jacket and 2 men flanking him, and stepped toward a set of oak doors where a woman he had never met was standing with her hand already raised, telling him he was not coming in like that. Elena Voss had grown up inside Ashford Chapel the way other children grew up inside their parents' shops. Underfoot, half in the way, learning the business by watching it happen around her. She knew, before she knew most other things, how to fold a program insert in thirds, how to keep a grieving family schedule from falling apart, how to make a room feel like it was holding people up instead of pressing them down. She had also learned, at 11 years old, exactly what happened when a chapel let the wrong thing through its doors. It had been a rival family's funeral, decades before Damian Cross was old enough to carry a gun of his own. Her father had run the chapel the way his father had, welcoming, unquestioning, believing that grief was grief no matter whose name was on the casket. He hadn't believed a mourner would come in with a weapon under his coat until one did, until an old argument settled itself in the middle of a eulogy, until her father stepped between 2 men who were never his to protect and took a bullet meant for someone else entirely. He survived. Barely. He walked with a cane for the rest of his life, and he rewrote the chapel's rules from his hospital bed. No weapons through these doors. Not for anyone. Not for family, not for police. Not for men who swore they only carried for protection. Everyone screened at the entrance, no exceptions, or the service didn't happen at all. Elena had inherited the chapel 5 years ago, along with the rule, along with a debt that had been quietly growing since her father's medical bills outlived his ability to work. She ran the numbers most nights after the last car left the parking lot. The mortgage on the building, the wages for her small staff, the slow bleed of a business built on other people's worst days. A property developer had made her an offer twice already, folded into paperwork so friendly it almost looked like help. She'd turned it down twice. She wasn't sure how many more times she could afford to. The man handling that offer on the buyer's behalf called himself a consultant. Victor Reyes was polished the way old money was polished. A good coat, an easy laugh, a habit of remembering the names of people other men in his position never bothered to learn. He'd been the one to book Ashford Chapel for the memorial 3 days ago, paying in full in cash, for a service under a name Elena didn't recognize and a deceased she'd never heard mentioned in the neighborhood before. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Chapels hosted strangers' grief every week. But she'd noticed 2 small things while preparing the room, the way she noticed everything, out of habit more than suspicion. The flower order that arrived that afternoon had been signed for by a name that didn't match the family listed on the booking. And the guest book, when she'd set it out on its stand by the door, already had a single signature inside it, written in a hand too careful, too rehearsed, to belong to someone signing their own name. She'd nearly mentioned the mismatched signature to Marcus, her assistant, that afternoon, then decided against it. A stranger's odd paperwork wasn't unusual enough on its own to interrupt a busy setup schedule, and she had 3 other bookings that week that needed her attention more urgently. It was the kind of small decision that meant nothing at the time and everything in hindsight, the sort of thing she would replay later, wondering how much earlier she might have understood if she'd trusted the instinct the moment it appeared instead of filing it away for later. She filed both facts away the way she filed away everything odd that crossed her desk, worth remembering, not yet worth acting on. Then, at 7 that evening, 3 cars pulled into her lot at once, and a man in a dark coat walked toward her doors with the particular stillness of someone used to people getting out of his way. Elena had learned to recognize that stillness a long time ago. It was the same stillness the man who shot her father had carried. She stepped in front of the door before he reached it. Her staff had learned over the years not to question her when she moved like that. Quick, certain, already 3 steps ahead of whatever was about to happen. Marcus, her assistant coordinator, had started quietly gathering the guest book and the vase of lilies from the entry table without being asked, the way he always did when Elena's shoulders squared a certain way. It was a small, practiced choreography, born out of a rule that had cost her father his ability to walk without a cane, and she had never once let herself forget the price that rule had already been paid for. She thought, in the half-second before the man in the dark coat reached her doors, about her father sitting in his hospital bed all those years ago, rewriting the chapel's protocols in handwriting made unsteady by morphine and fury in equal measure. No exceptions, he'd told her, when she was old enough to understand what the rule actually meant. Not for the ones who scare you and not for the ones who don't. The moment you start deciding who the rule applies to, it isn't a rule anymore. It's a favor. And favors get people killed. She had never had to test that rule against someone who looked like this. 3 cars, 2 visible men flanking him, the kind of composed danger that made the hair on her arms rise before her mind had finished cataloging why. But a rule that only held under easy circumstances wasn't a rule at all, and she stepped forward anyway, because that was the whole point of having one. "I'm sorry," Elena said, and she meant it, because she could see in the tightness around his eyes that whatever brought him here had already cost him something. "You can't come in armed. House rule. No exceptions." Damian stopped a full foot from her, close enough that she had to hold her ground on instinct alone. "You know who I am. I know you're standing outside my chapel with a gun and 2 men who are also carrying," Elena said. "That's all I need to know to say no." One of his men shifted his weight, a small motion that meant something in whatever language men like that spoke to each other. Damian raised 2 fingers without looking at him, and the man went still again. "There's an invitation with my name on it as the deceased," Damian said, low enough that it wasn't meant to travel past her. "I have every reason to think someone in that building wants to make it come true tonight. Then you have every reason to leave the guns in the car and let me walk you in myself," Elena said. "Because if something happens in there, the last thing that room needs is more men with weapons deciding how to answer it. That's how it stopped being a memorial the first time I watched it happen. I was 11. My father still walks with a limp because a room full of armed men decided that was an acceptable risk to take with someone else's funeral." Behind her, one of Damian's men shifted forward half a step, and she heard the small, telling creak of a shoulder holster settling under a jacket. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Damian, because he was the one who would decide how the next 30 seconds went, not the men waiting for his signal. "You're outnumbered," Damian said, not as a threat, more as an observation, the way he might have noted the weather. "I've been outnumbered every day for 5 years," Elena said. It's never once been a reason to change the rule. It's usually the reason the rule exists in the first place. It wasn't the argument Damian had prepared for. He'd expected deference or fear, or the kind of quiet cooperation his name usually bought him. He hadn't expected a woman half his security detail size to plant herself in a doorway and make him feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like the gun in his jacket was the wrong answer instead of the obvious one. 5 minutes, he said finally. I want to see who's inside, and I want to see it without anyone getting hurt because I made your rule an exception. He handed his weapon to one of his men, who looked at him like he'd lost his mind, and told both men to wait outside. Elena ran a handheld scanner over him anyway, not out of distrust exactly, more out of a habit that had kept her chapel's floors clean of blood for 5 years running, and waved him through when it came back silent. The chapel was empty. No mourners, no officiant, no casket. Just rows of folding chairs facing a small table at the front, and on that table, a single enormous arrangement of white lilies, the kind his mother had loved, the kind he hadn't seen assembled that specific way since her own funeral 17 years ago. He crossed the room before Elena could stop him and read the card tucked into the flowers. Rest now. Love always, your mother. His mother had been dead for 17 years. Whoever had written that card had either forgotten that fact, or had never expected him to look closely enough to remember it. That's not her handwriting, Damian said, and his voice had lost every bit of its earlier authority. It sounded for a moment like the voice of the 9-year-old boy who had stood in front of a much smaller arrangement of lilies once before. Someone signed my mother's name to a card for my own funeral. Elena had already seen the guest book signature that afternoon and thought it looked rehearsed. Now, standing beside him, she understood exactly what kind of rehearsal it had been. Whoever ordered this room, she said carefully, paid a real florist with real cash, using a name that isn't on any invoice I have. Can find out who that was. But not tonight, and not with your men outside with their hands on their holsters. If you want the truth, you're going to have to trust the same rule that just made you feel like a stranger walking into your own building. He walked the length of the empty chapel once, slowly, the way a man walks a room he's trying to memorize. Whoever did this knew the flowers I'd notice. Knew the exact arrangement my mother used to order every year for her own mother's grave. That's not a detail you find by accident. That's a detail someone learned from being close enough to watch us grieve. Who was close enough? Lena asked. Family, Damian said. Or someone who spent so long being treated like family that nobody ever thought to ask the difference. He didn't say Victor's name yet. It would take him 3 more days to let himself say it out loud, even privately, even to the one person who had already started to suspect it. Elena walked him back toward the door he'd first refused to enter without a weapon, and this time neither of them mentioned the rule at all. It didn't need mentioning. It had already done exactly what it was built to do. Damian looked at her for a long moment, not at the chapel, not at the flowers, at her, and made a decision that would have been unthinkable to him 3 days earlier. Find out, he said. And don't tell Victor Reyes you're looking. He left through the back entrance that night, not the front, and Elena noticed that too. A man who had walked in ready to be seen, choosing now to walk out unseen. His 2 men waited by the cars, weapons returned to them the moment they cleared her doors, and neither of them asked what had happened inside. It wasn't their place to ask. It rarely was. Elena locked the chapel alone that night, the way she always did, running her hands along the backs of the folding chairs out of habit more than necessity, checking that nothing had been left behind by whoever had staged the room. She found nothing else. No second card, no hidden note. But she found herself standing in front of the lilies for a long time anyway, turning her father's old rule over in her mind like a stone she hadn't looked at closely in years. The moment you start deciding who the rule applies to, it isn't a rule anymore. She hadn't broken it tonight. She'd bent the exact letter of it. 5 minutes, 1 man, weapons surrendered at the door, but the spirit had held. Damian Cross had walked through her chapel with empty hands, the same as anyone burying a mother or a father or a friend, and whatever waited for him on the other side of that forged signature, it hadn't found him unarmed and alone. It had found him unarmed and watched. She didn't sleep well that night. She kept thinking about the handwriting on that card, the careful, deliberate slant of it, and the particular kind of person who would take the time to get a dead woman's signature almost right. The florist's name was on a delivery slip Elena kept for exactly this kind of reason. Not suspicion, just habit, the same habit that had her filing every invoice and signature that passed through her building whether she thought she'd need it or not. She drove to the flower shop the next morning before her own staff arrived, and found an old woman named Dottie who remembered the order clearly, because it wasn't the kind of order she got often. Cash, no card, no return address. A man in a gray suit who'd asked for lilies specifically, who'd known exactly which arrangement to request without needing to be shown a catalog, who'd paid extra to have the card signed in a hand that looked like an older woman's. "He gave me a name to write on the receipt," Dottie said, flipping through her book. "Not his own. Some kind of code. I figured businessmen do that sometimes." Said if anyone asked, to say the order came from the gardener. Elena had heard that name exactly once before, in an offhand comment from the developer's paperwork 6 months earlier, listed as the private signature Victor Reyes used on transactions he didn't want traced back to his public name. She didn't tell Damian that night. She told him 3 days later, after she'd checked it twice, because being wrong about a man like Victor Reyes wasn't the kind of mistake she could afford to make once, let alone twice. By then, the pressure on her chapel had already changed shape. The developer's offer, which had sat patiently on her desk for months, suddenly had a deadline attached. 30 days, take it or lose the option entirely, delivered by a courier who worked, she now understood, for the same firm Victor used for everything he didn't want his own name on. "That's not a coincidence," Damian said, when she finally told him both things at once, in the back office of the chapel with the lights low and the front doors locked. "Victor doesn't rush anything. If he's suddenly rushing you, it's because he wants this resolved, one way or another, before I have time to ask him the wrong question." She thought about telling him then about her own father's rule, about the exact shape of what happened when the people meant to protect a room decided they knew better than the woman standing at its door. He didn't, not yet. Some trust had to be earned in smaller pieces before it could carry that much weight. "I thought the point of a fixer was that he was loyal to you," Elena said. "He raised me," Damian said, and for a moment the authority dropped out of his voice entirely. "He taught me how to tie a tie for my mother's funeral because my father was too broken to do it himself that morning. He was loyal to my mother before she died, and to my father when he was strong enough to lead, and to me since I was 9 years old. I don't know what it would take for me to believe he'd do this. I don't know if I can believe it even with a florist's receipt in front of me." "Then don't believe me," Elena said. "Believe the guest book. Believe the flower card. Believe the fact that someone spent real money making sure your mother's handwriting was forged well enough to fool you for exactly as long as it took you to see it up close. Whoever did that knew you. Not from a distance. From close enough to know what would make you stop and read the card twice." Damian didn't answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about Victor at all. "My father's dying," he said. "Slower than anyone outside the family knows. 6 months, maybe less. Victor's known for longer than I have. If he's moving against me now, it's not about an old grudge. It's about who's standing in this family when my father's chair is empty." It was the first time either of them said out loud what the invitation had actually meant. Not a threat. Calendar. Elena thought about her own ledgers that night, the way she always thought in numbers when the rest of the world got too large to hold in her hands at once. 6 months, Damian had said. A window that size wasn't chosen by accident by a man as careful as Victor was described to be. It was chosen because it was long enough to look natural, and short enough that whoever ended up sitting in Marcus Cross's chair when he died would already be too entrenched to challenge. She started keeping a second file after that, separate from the chapel's normal records, filled with nothing but dates. The day the invitation arrived, the day the developer's offer changed shape, the day the florist described the man in the gray suit. Patterns didn't announce themselves. They had to be built one small fact at a time, the same way a seating chart got built out of 100 tiny decisions nobody in the room ever noticed unless something went wrong. 2 nights later, walking her usual final round of the chapel before locking up, She found Damian's car still parked at the far edge of her lot, engine off, headlights dark. She knocked on the window before she let herself think better of it. "You've been sitting out here for 40 minutes, she said when he rolled it down. "I didn't want to go home yet," Damian admitted, and there was something almost boyish in how reluctantly he said it, a version of himself she suspected very few people ever saw. "My house feels different since the invitation. Like I keep waiting for the next envelope." "Then don't sit in a parking lot," Elena said. "Come inside. I have coffee that's better than it has any right to be. And a ledger you're going to want to see eventually anyway." He followed her in without argument, and for an hour neither of them talked about Victor at all. Just the chapel, her father's rule, the particular stubbornness it took to run a business built entirely on other people's grief without letting it hollow you out. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't even really about the case. It was, Elena realized only afterward, the first ordinary conversation either of them had had with the other, and it mattered more than she expected it to. The reversal came from a name Elena hadn't thought to check. Her own guest book, the one from the staged memorial, which still sat in a drawer in her office because she hadn't known what else to do with it. She'd assumed, the first time she read that single forged signature, that it was meant only for Damian. Proof, maybe a taunt, evidence that someone had walked through her chapel pretending to mourn a man who was still breathing. But when she finally looked at it properly, under better light, she realized the signature wasn't a random flourish. It was a name. Real one. Isabel Cross, Damian's younger sister, who'd left the family business a decade ago and hadn't set foot near it since. "She's not part of this," Damian said when Elena showed him. "She hasn't spoken to Victor in years. She hasn't spoken to me in years, not really." "Then why does a stranger practicing your mother's handwriting also know your sister's full legal name and a signature close enough to pass for hers?" Lena asked. "This isn't about you alone, Damian. Someone's building a guest book of everyone who could stand between Victor and an empty chair. You're the first name. I don't think you're the last." It landed harder than either of them expected. Damian had spent 3 days treating the invitation as a threat aimed squarely at him. Something he could absorb, the way he'd absorbed every threat aimed at him his whole adult life. He hadn't considered that it might be the opening line of something much longer, something that ended with his sister, and possibly his father, and possibly Elena herself, once Victor realized how much she already knew. He called Isabel that night for the first time in 8 months. She didn't answer. He called Victor instead, testing him without meaning to, mentioning the flowers, the handwriting, watching for anything that didn't sit right in the older man's voice. "Forget the flowers," Victor said. "Whoever's playing games with you, I'll handle it personally. You don't need to be chasing florists, Damian. You need to be planning your father's transition before someone else plans it for you." It was, on its surface, exactly the kind of steady, protective advice Victor had given him 1,000 times before. It was only afterward, lying awake, that Damian understood what was wrong with it. Victor hadn't asked who sent the invitation. He hadn't asked who forged the handwriting. A man who had spent 20 years anticipating every danger before Damian saw it coming had just spent an entire phone call refusing to be curious about the most dangerous thing that had happened to this family in a decade. He told Elena the next morning, standing in her chapel's garden before her staff arrived, and for the first time since this began, his certainty cracked all the way open. "I've trusted him with everything," he said. "My mother's funeral. My father's business. My own life more than once. If I'm wrong about you, I lose a stranger I've known for 2 weeks. If I'm wrong about him, I lose the only father I've actually had." Elena didn't offer him comfort, because comfort wasn't what the moment needed. "You're not choosing between 2 people," she said. "You're choosing between what's true and what's comfortable. Those aren't always the same thing. And pretending they are is how your father's chair ends up filled by whoever's willing to lie the longest." They both knew, standing there, what came next. Damian's father's health had become too fragile to hide much longer. A real wake, not a staged one, was coming, sooner than anyone wanted, and Victor would be the one organizing it, the same way he organized everything the family didn't want its fingerprints on. If he was building a guest book of names to remove, that wake wouldn't be a memorial. It would be the trigger. Isabel Cross called Elena directly 2 days later. Not Damian, not the family lawyers, but the woman whose chapel had somehow ended up holding a forged version of her own signature. Her voice was guarded at first, the voice of someone who had spent 10 years keeping the family's business at arm's length on purpose. "I want to know exactly why my name is sitting in a stranger's guest book," Isabel said. "And I want to hear it from someone who isn't trying to pull me back into something I already walked away from once." Elena told her plainly. The invitation, the flowers, the alias, the pattern of names that looked less like a threat and more like a list. She half expected Isabel to hang up, to retreat further, to decide the safest thing was distance the way she'd decided it a decade earlier. Instead, Isabel went quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. "Victor sent flowers to my apartment 3 weeks ago. No note. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it. He used to do that when I was a kid, small kindnesses, nothing that ever felt like a threat. I didn't think it was reconnaissance." It was one more piece of the pattern falling into place. Proof that whatever Victor was building, he'd been quietly mapping every person who could complicate it long before the fake invitation ever reached Damian's kitchen table. Elena wrote the date down in her second file, next to all the others, and felt the shape of the thing solidify into something she could finally hand to someone with the authority to act on it. They had 3 weeks before Damian's father's health made the real wake unavoidable, and Elena used every day of it the only way she knew how. Methodically, quietly, the way she balanced a ledger. The central clues stayed the same. A forged signature and a florist's receipt pointing to Victor's private alias. What she needed now was something that couldn't be explained away as coincidence, and she found the first piece of it in her own security log, the one her father had insisted on keeping even after most chapels his size had stopped bothering. 3 weeks before the staged invitation arrived, one of her 2 weapons screening staff had been quietly reassigned to a different shift by a scheduling change she hadn't approved. A change made through a temp agency her office used for overflow events, paid for by a client account that traced back, after 2 frustrating phone calls, to a shell company registered under the same law firm Victor used for the developer's offer on her chapel. Someone had paid to make sure her screening staff would be short-handed on a night they'd chosen in advance. It hadn't mattered for the staged memorial, because nothing real had been planned to happen there. It had only ever been a test, a card sent to see whether Damian would walk in armed or unarmed, whether her rule would hold or bend. She understood that now. The first invitation hadn't been the trap. It had been the rehearsal. The independent verification came from Dottie the florist again, who, once Elena explained gently what was actually at stake, agreed to keep the man in the gray suit's next order, if one came, and to call before delivering it instead of after. The final proof came 10 days later, in a ledger Dottie hadn't thought to mention the first time, because she hadn't thought a florist's cash box mattered to anyone. Tucked behind an invoice for the lilies was a second slip of paper the same man had left by accident, a handwritten note listing a date, a location, and the words confirm scanner rotation, west entrance, same as before. The date was the day of Damian's father's wake. The location was Elena's chapel. It was already booked, already paid for, under Victor's name this time, with no attempt to hide it at all, because he no longer expected to need to. "He's not planning to get away with it quietly," Damian said, staring at the note in Elena's office. "He's planning to have it look sanctioned. Officers on the payroll, called in for security, positioned at the one door where the scanner's supposed to be watched. If I walk in armed that day, you'll be exactly what he needs you to be," Elena finished. "A man with a gun in a room full of witnesses, killed by security doing its job. No one investigates that. No one avenges that. Your father's too sick to challenge it, and your sister's too far removed to know it happened until it's already been explained to her." Damian's hand found the edge of her desk and gripped it, not out of anger at her, but at the 20 years he'd spent handing this man the exact blueprint of how to end him. "Then I go in unarmed," he said. "Same as last time." "You go in unarmed," Elena agreed. "And you let me handle my door the way I've always handled it. No exceptions, not even for you, not even that day. If Victor's counting on your gun to make the story work, The story falls apart the moment you don't give him one. Elena spent the 2 days before the wake going over every entrance to her chapel personally, checking each scanner herself instead of trusting the routine to her staff, the way she hadn't bothered to since the very first week she'd inherited the building. She thought more than once about simply calling the whole thing off, telling Damian to hold his father's wake somewhere else, somewhere without a history, somewhere that wasn't hers to lose if the plan failed. She never seriously considered it. Her father hadn't built a rule that only applied when the stakes were manageable, and she wasn't about to become the first Voss to decide. This was the exception that finally proved him wrong. It cost Damian something to agree to that, more than she realized at first. His men argued with him for an hour before the wake, certain that walking in unarmed while a corrupt security detail waited inside was suicide dressed up as principal. He held to it anyway, because somewhere in the 3 weeks of florist receipts and forged signatures and long, quiet evenings spent going over evidence in Elena's back office, he had started trusting her rule the way he'd once trusted Victor's advice. Not blindly, but because it had held up every single time under weight that should have broken it. They spent the morning of the wake setting up chairs together, an ordinary, unremarkable task neither of them needed to do personally. Neither of them mentioned that it was the first quiet hour either had had in 3 weeks. It didn't need mentioning. It was there in the ease of working alongside someone who had stopped needing to be convinced. "If this goes wrong today," Damian said, lining up the last row, "it's not your fight to die in. It became my fight the day someone used my chapel to write your death card," Elena said. "I don't hand my door over to anyone. Not Victor. Not you. That's the whole point." The wake for Marcus Cross drew nearly 200 people. Family, longtime associates, city officials who'd known him decades ago before his name meant what it meant now. Elena stood at the west entrance the way she always did, scanner in hand, watching the line of dark coats file past her one at a time. Victor arrived early as he always did, greeting mourners with the same easy warmth he'd used for 20 years. And for a moment Elena wondered if she'd built an entire case out of coincidence. Then, 40 minutes into the service, 2 men in plain suits approached the west door together, badges visible, radios clipped to their belts, and one of them reached for the door handle without slowing down for the scanner at all. "I need you both to stop there," Elena said. The taller officer smiled the way people smiled when they expected a rule to bend for them. "We're on Reyes's detail. We're not going through your metal detector, ma'am. Everyone goes through the door the same way," Elena said, loud enough now that the family gathered nearby began to turn. "No exceptions. That's not new today. Ask anyone who's ever buried someone here." Victor appeared at her shoulder almost instantly. His voice dropped low, urgent in a way she'd never heard from him. "Elena, not today. These men are here for security. Let them through. Security doesn't need a concealed weapon that bypasses my scanner on the one day you personally arranged the schedule to make sure my second screener called in sick," Elena said, and she said it clearly enough that Damian, 20 feet away beside his father's casket, heard every word. He crossed the room before Victor could stop him. What is she talking about? For the first time in Damian's life, Victor didn't have an answer ready. Elena reached into her jacket and produced the folded slip of paper Dottie had kept for her. The note about the scanner rotation, the same handwriting as the flower card 3 weeks earlier, the same alias, the gardener, written at the bottom in Victor's own private code. She held it up where Damian and his father's oldest lieutenants, and the 2 officers still frozen at the door, could all see it. 3 weeks ago, someone sent an invitation to Damian's own memorial and had it delivered to my chapel, she said. "I run the only building in this city that screens every single guest at the door, no matter who they are. That made me the one obstacle standing between a plan and a body. So someone paid to have my second scanner pulled off shift for the night that invitation was tested, and paid again for today to make sure it happened for real, with officers who wouldn't have to pass through my door like everyone else." A murmur moved through the assembled mourners, the particular sound of 200 people trying to decide, all at once, whether to look at Victor or look away from him. Sophia, standing near the front with Damian's other men, quietly moved to block the west door herself, cutting off the officer's clearest path outside. Isabel Cross, who had arrived that morning for the first time in a decade, stepped forward from the family's front row and stood beside her brother, close enough that the symbolism of it, the two names Victor's careful signatures had targeted, standing shoulder to shoulder against him, needed no explanation to anyone in the room who understood what a guestbook was for. "This is absurd," Victor said, but his voice had lost its warmth entirely. "A florist's scrap of paper. Anyone could have written that." "Anyone could have," Elena agreed. "But I called Dottie's shop from this room 10 minutes ago and asked her to describe the man who paid her in cash, using the name the gardener. Twice, once for the flowers on Damian's fake funeral, and once for the arrangement sitting behind you right now, which you ordered under your own name this time, because you didn't think you'd need to hide it anymore." Marcus Cross, frail and seated near the front with an oxygen line at his side, lifted a hand for silence, and the room gave it to him the way it had given him silence for 40 years. "Victor," the old man said, "look at me." Victor didn't move. "I built this family on the belief that the man watching my son's back would never need watching himself," Marcus said. "Tell me now, in front of everyone who's carried my name for a lifetime, whether that belief was ever true." The silence that followed lasted longer than anyone in the room could have measured, and in it, Damian finally understood that his father's question had already answered itself. It was the officers at the door, moving instinctively toward the exit rather than toward Victor, who confirmed it beyond any doubt. Men who understood exactly whose payroll they'd actually been on, and exactly how quickly that protection had just ended. "Escort them out," Marcus said quietly. "All of them. And someone find my daughter. It's time she heard the truth from us before she hears it from anyone else." Victor was walked out through the same west door he had once tried to use unscreened, past the scanner he had paid to disable, past the woman who had refused, twice now, to let violence walk through her chapel unchecked. For a moment after the doors closed behind them, the chapel simply breathed. 200 people exhaling at once, the way a room does when a danger it only half understood has finally passed. Damian didn't move to comfort his father, or to embrace his sister, or to thank Elena in front of everyone watching. He walked instead to the west entrance, to the scanner Elena still held loosely in one hand, and stood beside her the way he'd stood beside her the very first night, except this time there was no argument left between them. "You could have let them through," he said quietly. "Just this once. Nobody would have blamed you for it, today of all days." "That's exactly the day the rule matters most," Elena said. "The day everyone's grieving too hard to notice what's walking through the door. That's the only day it was ever built for. Nobody drew a weapon. Nobody needed to." By the end of that month, Victor Reyes had lost everything the organization had ever given him. His authority, his protection, the officers who'd once answered to his money, the family that had once treated him as its own blood. He wasn't executed and he wasn't forgiven. He was simply removed, quietly and completely, the way a man is removed when the people who once trusted him finally stop needing his advice to know what's true. Marcus Cross lived another 4 months, long enough to see his daughter Isabel return home for the first time in a decade, long enough to rewrite the family's succession plans with both his children in the room instead of one man standing between them. Damian took his father's place not as the boy who'd nearly walked armed into his own death, but as the man who'd learned in one chapel doorway that the people who protect you honestly are rarely the loudest ones in the room. He changed one rule immediately, the first real reform of his leadership. No member of the family, regardless of rank, would ever again be permitted to arrange a gathering, a wedding, a wake, a simple dinner, without at least one person present who answered to no one but themselves. He called it privately the Ashford Rule. Ashford Chapel itself never sold. The developer's offer quietly disappeared the week Victor did, and Damian offered, more than once, to simply clear Elena's debt outright as thanks. She turned him down every time. "You don't owe me your money," she told him, the last evening they stood together in the garden where they'd first argued over a locked door. "You owe the next person who walks through my chapel the same rule you got. That's the only payment that means anything to me." Isabel came by the chapel that same week on her own without Damian, and sat with Elena in the office for an hour talking about nothing in particular, the business of running a small, stubborn place that refused to bend for anyone. It became, without either of them planning it, A standing appointment. Elena had spent 5 years running Ashford Chapel largely alone, inheriting not just a building but a kind of isolation that came from being the only person who understood exactly what the rule had cost her family to keep. Having someone else in the room who understood the weight of an inherited name, an inherited debt, an inherited promise, was its own kind of healing, separate entirely from whatever was or wasn't happening between her and Damian. Marcus Cross, in his final months, asked to see the chapel once, before he was too weak to make the trip. Elena walked him through it herself, past the rows of chairs, past the west door where a corrupt detail had once tried to bypass a metal detector, and he stopped at the entrance for a long moment, leaning on his cane in a way that reminded her, sharply and without warning, of her own father. "My son tells me you never once considered making an exception," Marcus said. "Not for him. Not for anyone." "No, sir," Elena said. "That's not how the rule works." "Good," the old man said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice. "I've spent 40 years surrounded by men who made exceptions for whoever frightened them most. Cost me more than I ever told my children. I'd like my last request in this building to be a small one. Keep the rule exactly as it is, long after both of us are gone." She promised him she would, and she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with any of the men who had walked through her doors that year, armed or otherwise. It was a promise to her father, too, carried forward the only way she knew how. Damian kept his father's chair, but not his father's habits. Within a year, Ashford Chapel's screening protocol had quietly become a template circulated among a handful of other families who'd grown tired of losing people to rooms nobody had thought to secure. Elena never asked for that recognition and never took credit for it publicly, but she noticed every so often a new client mentioning that they'd heard about her rule from someone 2 cities over. Proof that the smallest, most stubborn kind of integrity had a way of traveling further than anyone expected. Victor was never seen in the city again. There was no dramatic ending to his story, no final confrontation, no satisfying violence to close the loop the way the old rules of that world once demanded. He simply lost every door that had ever opened for him, one at a time, until there were none left, and the family he'd spent 2 decades trying to control moved on without him in a way that was, in its own quiet fashion, its own kind of justice. What grew between them after that grew slowly, the way trust always had to when it was built on something sturdier than fear. A shared meal that had nothing to do with danger, a disagreement over chair arrangements that ended in laughter instead of tension, an ordinary Tuesday where he came by simply because he wanted to, not because anyone's life depended on it. Neither of them rushed toward anything. Neither of them needed to. She had already proven at her own front door exactly what she believed a person was worth protecting for, and he had already proven, by disarming himself twice, exactly how much he'd learned to trust it. There's a version of this story where the woman at the door lets the powerful man in exactly as he arrives, armed and certain and used to getting his way. In that version, nobody ever finds out what was waiting for him inside. In this one ordinary rule, enforced without exception, even against the man everyone else was too afraid to stop, was the only thing standing between a false ending and a real one. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you were the one standing at that door, knowing exactly who you were about to turn away, would you have held the line? Or would you have made the exception everyone expects powerful people to get? If this story moved you, tell me your answer in the comments below. And if you want more stories like it, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling them.